where our Global Reading Network is based. We're a community of practice serving the global community that is supporting early grade reading, early grade reading for children around the world. And we are sponsored by USAID. This is actually a bit of a follow-up to a program we had earlier this year on tracking and tracing books, out of which there was some interest in getting some more support in terms of preparing for effective book procurements. And so we decided to follow up with a series of sessions, and we are actually preparing guidance on this issue. So please look for that sometime soon. Today we have a couple of speakers with us who are experts in the field, who are leaders in the field, and I want to introduce them, and then I'm going to pass it on to our moderator to work with us, or to share what our objectives are for this webinar. And so I would like to introduce first Linda Hiebert, who is the Global Book Alliance Senior Advisor. The GBA is a partnership of public and private stakeholders working to ensure that all children have high quality books and the ability to effectively use them by 2024. Previously, she was Vice President for Education at World Vision for 7 years, and she has extensive experience living in Asia, working in Africa, Latin America, and the Middle East, and she graduated from the Kennedy School, Harvard University, with an MPA. David Muita, who is joining us from Kenya, who can wave. He's a teacher by choice. That was the first thing he wanted us to let everybody know. He has a bachelor's in science from Nairobi University, diploma in human resource management from the Kenya Institute of Administration. He's been in educational publishing for the last 30 years. Today, David is the managing director of Moran Publishers. He's a former chairman of the Kenya Publishers Association, and he is credited with the development and launch of the first textbook policy in Kenya in 1998. David is the founder of the Nairobi International Book Fair, the National Book Development Council of Kenya, and the East African Book Development Association, and he was a member of the Kenya National Libraries Board for 8 years. Also joining me here in Washington, D.C. is Penelope Bender. She's the head of Global Education Services at Burda Education, an international publishing, printing, and distribution company. She came to Burda from USAID, where she was the lead for early grade reading, Goal 1 of the USAID Education Strategy, and the coordinator of the Global Book Alliance. Prior to USAID, she worked for the Hewlett Foundation and the Gates Foundation on the Quality Education in Developing Countries Initiative. Dr. Bender has worked extensively on education issues at the World Bank. She holds a master's in international education from Harvard University and a PhD in teaching, curriculum, and education policy from Michigan State University. And we also have joining us remotely Roel de Haas online. Roel has decades of experience working in various sectors of the book supply chain. He is CEO of blueTree Group, a social enterprise with the mission to enhance access to affordable quality books. He conducts country assessments and provides technical assistance in the book supply chain in over a dozen countries in Africa, Asia, Latin America, and the Middle East. Since 2010, he actively participated in events such as CIES, USAID Summits, Communities of Practices, and Global Book Alliance meetings to share his knowledge. Two moderators working with us today. The first one is Sofia Cozzolino. Sophia is an early grade reading specialist with extensive experience supporting book development and use in East Africa. She's provided technical leadership on the Rwanda Children's Book Initiative, a project that has transformed the indigenous publishing industry in Rwanda. And later I will introduce Anna Robledo, who will join us later in the middle of our session. So I'm going to turn this over to Sophia to share with us the objectives for the workshop today.
Good morning. As Jennifer said, my name is Sofia Cozzolino, and I will be facilitating some of the discussions in today's workshop with these industry experts. I think our overall objective is to empower participants to support more effective procurements of reading materials. So we're hoping that these industry experts will shed some light on how to make sure that those procurements are efficient in terms of staff time, bidders time, and economical. So more specifically, we're going to have some sessions that will touch on how to understand the role of the major actors in the book chain and what their distinct responsibilities are. We'll also be discussing some criteria to consider when preparing your early grade reading materials procurement package, how to attract the most eligible bidders, And we'll also have a session looking at how to manage your RFQ and what some of those project management principles are. So without further ado, we're going to start by having Linda, who was already introduced, talk a little bit about the Global Book Alliance, what their objective is, and what some updates on their initiatives, particularly those that relate to procurement.
Thank you, Sophia. That's a really good start to what we want to do today. I think this is really an important piece of work, especially for the Global Book Alliance. And it's a real privilege to be here with Dr. Bender and Roel and David as real experts in this field. The Global Book Alliance is a partnership of organizations that are looking to really tackle the entire book chain. We're very interested to fill the gap that is a shortage of books that is so severe across the entire globe that it's really going to take some innovations to solve this book chain. And I think this is particularly true in the procurement area. The book chain for us actually spans the entire process of developing books as well all the way to using books. One of the things that we are very interested in doing is really looking at the process of procurement. Why? Because we know that teaching and learning materials are really essential for learning, and they have one of the most important impacts on that learning process for children. And we also know that we have found through a feasibility study that actually Dr. Bender had initiated some years ago, that the major donors that are providing procurement and providing budgets towards government procurement of books, they spent millions and millions of dollars over the last several decades. But yet we still see a very severe short-term project approach. So donors are only doing that on maybe a one-year or annual basis. We also see underfinancing by governments and by donors. We see supply chain inefficiencies in the whole system, and we see high levels of loss and damage along that process in terms of distribution. And then finally, there's lack of coordination. When we look at the procurement process in the book chain, the entire book chain, we see those efficiencies, particularly in procurement areas of unpredictable demand, and that's a problem of data collection, inadequate budgeting, insufficient planning, small print run sizes, lack of transparency, use of uneconomical printers, inefficient book specifications, etc. So there are many, many problems that the procurement process is facing. So what is the GBA's involvement in this? The GBA would like to work with across the entire spectrum of the publishing industry as well as governments and donors to really tackle these problems. So one of the things that we have started to look at is in the procurement area, what are the policies of purchasing, printing, and delivering? What are the standards that we need to really look at in terms of technical specifications in the physical quality and use of books? What is the cost-sharing model that might be applied to the production of books? And then what can we do in terms of that transparency piece that is so important in terms of how we're going to actually get governments and publishers and printers, as well as those that are delivering books, to trust each other. And then finally, how can we incorporate the participation of the publishing industry in this process? So we are very interested in looking at this as a whole of the, tackling this as a whole of the book chain. One of the things that we are doing is looking at this as a piece of many parts that need to work together effectively. And so we're looking at what we can do with the publishing industry to help tackle some of the issues there that would impact how procurement is done. We're looking at how do we develop titles that can then, particularly in languages that are not as prevalently supported with materials, particularly just readers for libraries and digital options. And then finally, we're looking at doing some country pilots that will incorporate all the pieces of that book chain.
Thank you, Linda. That was a great overview of the very ambitious Global Book Alliance and all the different moving pieces within that. So next we wanted to look at the book chain and who the different actors are and what their roles and responsibilities are within that. So we have this great diagram that shows you just a bit of all the steps that are involved in that book chain. And this isn't even comprehensive. We have other actors that are not displayed here, such as authors, illustrators, but it does give you a sense of how complex that process is. For a child to sit in a school and read a high quality book, there were so many actions that needed to have happened before that. So we're hoping that if participants can have a clear understanding of what the roles and responsibilities are of those actors in that process, you'll have a better sense of how to engage them throughout. So we're going to go back again to Linda, who's going to explain to us a little bit about what the role of Ministry of Educations and donors are in supporting that book chain in terms of early grade reading materials.
Great, thank you so much. So we wanted to, I was asked to look particularly at the government and donors specifically to what are those main roles that they play in the whole process of procurement. Some of the key roles for the government is providing the overall policy guidance, and what we are talking about there is allowing foreign companies to compete locally, as well as encouraging domestic involvement as well for domestic publishing companies. Secondly, the government would conduct periodic dialogue with publishers, printers, freight forwarders, and booksellers to gauge the industry capacity to carry out these various parts of the procurement process. So that would be looking at cost and availability of paper inside the pages, for example. The government's also set the evaluation criteria and weight of each criterion for evaluating the quality of the content offered. So there we're talking about setting a point system that would then help the government to evaluate the bidders. Then we also look at sets of the quality standards for selecting the book or other instructional materials. That would be around prescribing the weight of any given content for quality relative to the price. So would you weight the quality of the content to 60% and the price at around 40, for example. The government's also trained pools of evaluators of content quality. So that's again using different practitioners, technical experts that would be looking at the qualities of the content itself. And then establishing standardized technical specifications for the books themselves. So that would be the size of the book, the number of pages, etc. They also would look to apply strict laws and regulations and policies against any sort of fraudulent or corrupt practices. And they would encourage open and free competition. So example of that would be limiting the number of bidders, but also being very fair in looking at their participation. And then finally, for the governments, it would be looking at prompt responses to any suppliers' issues, inquiries, and making sure that they have a timely process of payment for claims against the procurement and delivery. For the donors, their particular involvement would be to provide clear guidance for the governments on procurement and eligibility for financing. It would be familiarizing the government with the donors' procurement guidelines and rules and regulations that are set by that donor. It would also be providing the third-party technical assistance to governments in the preparation and process of procurement activity. So, for example, setting technical specifications, developing procurement documents, and so on. The donors would also review and advise the government on the completeness and accuracy of the procurement documents. And then also they would help the government in all aspects of procurement, but they would not participate in the process itself. Donors also review and advise the government on the completeness and accuracy of the evaluation reports and recommendations to award contracts to evaluated bidders. In the cases of any complaints or any protests, the donors would help the government to take steps in a timely way to resolve any of those complaints or protests. And then finally, it would encourage the government to undertake periodic monitoring of the contract execution.
Thank you, Linda. That was very informative. We're now going to hear from David Muita, who is on the line. He's going to speak a little bit about the roles of publishers.
Just for all the panelists, publishing is a very complex process, and I'm happy this information has been well articulated, and I hope the attendees will understand the difficulties that the publishers go through. But our major role as we get into the industry is to help promote literacy. We feel like it's our duty that the children of the world should lead and lead efficiently. And the materials we provide should help them to do this. It's also the role of the publisher to research on the needs of the children so that we give quality as opposed to quantity. Because quite often, the donors do get it wrong sometimes and think volumes is what matter, whereas in our view, quality is extremely important. So proper research done by the publishers is key. When ready, we then prepare the materials through commissioning of authors. It is our job to do quality editing. It is our job to ensure we have quality illustrations. It is the job of the publisher to ensure that the designs are fantastic and appealing to the child. It is our job also to take the level of the child, knowing their level of understanding, knowing their limitation on vocabulary, so that we can grade the materials according to age or according to the child's ability. It is the job of the publisher to ensure that the materials so developed are marketed and distributed widely so that they reach the majority, if not all, of the deserving children. The publisher has a duty to reward the authors of the materials that they publish through the contracts that they sign, by paying their royalties on time, by protecting the copyright of the authors, and by overseeing that the materials, if selling outside their area of jurisdiction, then sub-rights are sold and paid for by the users in other countries. At the personal level, I feel it is the job of the publishers to encourage the establishment of libraries, to work and support government in establishing public libraries across all provinces, all districts, And this can be done through book donations, through collaborative efforts, because the government can also be a primary buyer of all the products that publishers produce. So it is our duty to support the development of libraries. Otherwise, it's useless to think we can only publish books and put them in schools that may not have established libraries, may not have proper storage facilities, and therefore the books will have a very short shelf life if not properly put in libraries that will ensure that the books will last longer in the market than is presently the case. There are many other roles that we can talk about that we need to do, but some of these can be discussed as we get along or through any specific questions that the attendees and participants would have. Thank you.
Touched on some interesting points around book development, but also some of the responsibilities of publishers to stimulate demand for the books that they're producing. You also talked a little bit about distribution of the materials, which can also be done by a distributor. So now I'm going to hand over to Penelope, who's going to talk to us about the role of printers and distributors in the book chain.
All right, thank you. Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon or good evening, wherever you may happen to be. Before I talk about printers and distributors, I just wanted to underline again the point that publishing, printing, and distribution are really separate industries, and they all have different roles in the book chain. Sometimes they work together, sometimes you might find two companies under one roof, but they really are separate industries. They require separate skills, separate equipment, different kinds of machinery. So when you're thinking about procuring, obtaining materials for early grade reading programs, you need to keep in mind that they are distinct actors. So I'm just going to touch quickly on the role of printers and then the role of distributors. So as printers, we work in four main areas: pre-press, printing, finishing and binding, and pick and pack. In pre-press, we take a look at your files and we make sure that the files are ready for large-scale printing. It's very important that the text, the artwork, the layout all be in good shape when we originally receive the file, so that when it's reproduced, they're reproduced multiple times at high speed, you get the kind of quality that you want. So we work back and forth with clients and with programs to make sure that the files look the way they need to look. And we always then provide proofs. Proofs can either be hard copy or electronic. I encourage you to try to get hard copies of your proofs. It's a much better way to review. Of course, it does take time, and we'll talk about timelines a little bit later. It takes more time to transmit a hard copy proof than an electronic proof, but it gives you a better sense of what you're getting, and I think it gives you more opportunity to correct any errors you might find or any changes you decide you want to make. After the proofs are approved, we then engrave your images and text on a cylinder or on a printing plate, depending on what kind of printing will be done. The next step is the actual printing. So in order to print your books, we have to have large stocks of paper, ink, and consumables. And that is an area that I think we can work together to expand understanding of, especially around the availability of paper. Paper is a global market, like many other commodities. And so the prices go up and the prices come down, and the kinds of stocks that printers maintain depend on what's happening in the global paper market. So at certain times of year, paper is more expensive, which means it's scarce, and at certain times of year, there's more paper, and it's less expensive. So you need to think about that. Also, if you're looking for unusual paper sizes or unusual types of paper, it might be harder to obtain it. It might take your printer longer to find it or to find the quantity that you need. So once we have the paper, once we have the ink, we prepare the printing machines, we check the paper, ink, and color matching. Color matching is quite an art to make sure you get exactly the shade of blue that you want in your book. We spend a lot of time on that. We work on printing speed to make sure the machines run efficiently, monitor the quality throughout printing. And then another important point that I'm not sure gets enough attention is that we make sure to recycle all wasted paper. In any print job, no matter how high quality your printers, your printing machines, you are going to have some copies that will not be correct, that will need to be recycled. And so it's important to find a printer who does take the steps necessary to recycle that wasted paper. The next step is finishing and binding, and that's where we put the books together. We bind them according to the specifications that you have given us, which we hope always is appropriate for the size of the book and the number of pages in the book. And then we trim the books so that they have nice clean edges and they look like a finished book. The very last step is around pick and pack, and that's where we pack your books according to the contract. There are really two main methods. Some contracts, some programs want to have all their books delivered to a central warehouse. In the warehouse, they unpack them and then they repack them. Other programs decide to have their books packaged already by school at the point of production. And I can tell you from my experience on the donor side that there's a lot less waste if you pack your books by school. Because every step where people are opening the books and moving the books around is an opportunity for leakage. So packing by school is usually recommended. We use heavy-duty cartons, cover them with stretch wrap to make sure your books can't get wet. Although if you order them for delivery at peak rainy season in DRC, it can be tricky. We put straps on them to make them easy to carry, and we also label them. It's important to think about how heavy those cartons should be, and that really depends on how you're going to distribute your books. So I'm going to talk about distributors now, but when you think about packing, if you are counting on your books to be carried by people for the last mile, that's very different from if your books are going to be delivered by a truck for the last mile. So you need to consider that when you think about how many books you'll pack per box and the size of the boxes you'll use. We just found an order where they want 1,000 books per box. You can imagine those are huge. They're not going to be manageable by a distribution system that relies on canoes or donkeys or people. Those are for trucks. So moving into distributors, there's three main ways of distributing books. We do air freight, we do sea freight, and we do overland freight, usually a combination of those. Air freight is obviously much, much more expensive. We usually run into air freight requests when things are delayed, people are running late, you need the books right away, and so we do air freight, but it is much more expensive. And the other issue with air freight that Anna and I were talking about this morning was that the volume of books can make it very difficult to move them by air. Airplanes only have a certain size, books are very large in volume and very heavy, so you may end up needing more planes than the country actually has. So sea freight, if you can manage it, coupled with overland, is the way to go. We also work on pre-shipment paperwork. That helps us avoid delays. We palletize the books so that they can be moved by trucks and other kinds of equipment, offload the books, move them through customs, which as a program in country you can greatly facilitate by working together with us for customs. If we have to warehouse your books, we will warehouse them. Again, that's another opportunity for books to go missing. So if possible, you want to move them quickly out of the port or out of the point of entry onto the schools. We deliver to the final delivery sites, whichever ones you may have stipulated. We do a lot of tracking and tracing to make sure that the books get to the site when they're supposed to get there. So we can print barcodes on books, we can print QR codes on books, we can use less technical methods of tracking and tracing them, but we do make sure that your books get to where they need to go. We get the paperwork back to you. And probably the most important role of the distributor is to solve problems. So unexpected things always arise. It rains earlier than it was supposed to rain. The truck breaks down. The barge doesn't come when it's supposed to come. So the distributor is on the ground solving those problems and making sure that the books get through. And then, of course, at the end, we make sure that the containers and the pallets and everything else that came with the books gets back to where it needs to go. So I'll stop there. If there are any questions, I'll be glad to answer them afterwards.
Great. No, yeah, it's very interesting, and I'm sure it's generated plenty of questions. So if you want to begin sending those questions in the chat section, we're actually going to take them after the next session, and then we'll have quite a few more to address. So next up, I'm going to hand over to Ana Robledo, who is a research analyst at RTI International. She is a lead expert on book chain management and production of early grade reading materials. Ana has worked in the children's publishing industry for more than 10 years in Latin America. and she's been working in international education for more than 5 years. So I'm going to hand over now to Anna to take my seat here.
Thank you, Sophia. Hey, everybody. All right, so now that we've seen what a complex process this is and how many different actors participate in the book chain, we thought we would let Roel de Haas walk us through some of the criteria, implementing partners and ministries of education as well should keep in mind when preparing on early grade reading book procurement. So take it away, Roel.
Hello from the Netherlands. The consideration when we're thinking about early grade reading procurement. One of the things that the person in charge of procurement needs at least to have some basic knowledge, printing, logistic, taxes, and import process and regulations. The person in charge of procurement should be able to evaluate and validate the printing capacity and the logistic timelines of suppliers. We just heard also from Penelope that timelines in the whole process from printing, distribution, and procurement, printing, and distribution is a very, very key topic in almost the whole process. And the timeline is defined by the end user. Means when does the school start? When do we need the books in those classrooms? If we look at books, the main cost driver for books is paper. If we produce books in large volumes, the percentage of paper is around 50%. Also, when you look at paper, there are different paper types available, which might have price variation of plus or minus 20%. But as already mentioned, it is a commodity, so we have day-to-day prices in the world market. In the RFQs we see in the market is that there should be more protective RFQs and contracts. If we don't deliver in time, if there are not enough books in time, or quality, or timeline issues, it should be mentioned in the contract, and there should be some punishment if you don't deliver in time. Printing, shipping, and distribution is, there are separate processes, as Penelope already mentioned. However, if we can have the whole RFQ in one hand, it avoids finger pointing when something goes wrong or it's not delivered in time. Also, due to these very tight timelines, the printing, packaging, shipping, and distribution, whenever it's in one hand, it's much easier to control, to communicate. And both printing and distribution is all about communication. The technology used in RFQs is not always mentioned. When we have books, we can do saddle stitch, PUR, section shoeing, but it has a large influence on timelines. And last but not least, the distribution schedule list should be complete, detailed. Which schools, how many schools, where they are, so that at least the supplier can deliver the right bit to the vendor. Thank you.
So this is a great starting point for a discussion, and we would like both Penelope and David to give some comments on their perspectives as the publishers and the printers. I'll let David begin with comments from the publisher's perspective, which comes first in the book chain.
I would like perhaps to comment on the issue of distribution. We have seen situations where government or donors would want you to distribute books, but you are not provided with detailed information about the recipients and the quantities each recipient should have. It makes it very difficult for you to do a good job. We also have situations where, and I think there should be a consideration, even when awarding tenders, procurement, when procurement is being made, we've known situations where it is extremely difficult. The telling is extremely difficult on the ground. Areas where there are no roads, leave alone the rains, there are no roads whatsoever, and books have to be delivered to the door. It's a major challenge to the publishers. Security is something that has not been addressed. And whereas it is so easy in some parts of the world, it is very difficult in some parts, in other parts. Even in a country like Kenya, it is very easy to reach every corner of the central highroads. Very easy to get a few places in the Rift Valley, but you can have real difficulties in getting to the north or distributing books in schools in the northeastern region bordering Somalia and Ethiopia, risking both life and the books themselves. But it has to be done, so people have to look for a solution. When that is there, I think these are considerations that should be made when procurement is being made so that provisions can be provided. The publisher has very little resource in terms of money. It's normally assumed that publishers make a lot of money, but our margins are relatively very small. And those of us who are extremely patriotic, indeed, we almost work for free. But that said, it is necessary to assist the publisher from the word go, give them assistance so that they are able to develop quality materials. And let us provide materials that are probably indigenous, not materials that are prepared elsewhere and brought into the territory. So some of the few things I would say for now, others will probably come in as we continue.
Thank you, David. I'll let you respond, Penelope.
All right, I'm actually going to talk a little bit more about procurement. I certainly agree with all of David's comments on the issues around transport and also issues around security. That's a very important point. We work in a lot of places where security is important. So I would just like to underline again that when you're thinking about textbook and TLM procurement in general, you're really looking at three different functions: publishing, printing, and distribution. And you need to make a decision about whether you're going to package it all together or in separate contracts. I kind of think about it in terms of whether you're going to hire a general contractor when you renovate your house or whether you're going to hire separate tradespeople to do separate activities. Sometimes it's good to have a general contractor. You might have less headaches, but it's going to be more expensive because they will charge for the oversight. And sometimes you'll hire individual actors who will work, for example, just on printing or just on distribution or on a combination. So it really depends on the situation where you're working and what kinds of companies are available to do the work there. I will tell you that from reviewing prices over the last probably 10 years, you will definitely get lower printing prices if you do international competition. There's no way around it. Your national actors will compete, your international actors will compete, and the more people you have involved in competition, the more the prices will come down. So if that's what you're looking at, if that's one of your goals, you do want to do international procurement for your printing. Publishing, I completely agree with David. It's a completely different enterprise. But for printing, international will lower the prices. So when you're thinking about procurement, you're thinking about three main goals. You want multiple high-quality responsive bids, you want your procurement process completed on time, and you want your contracts executed correctly and on time. So to get high-quality responsive bids, it's very important to publicize that RFP or RFQ once you get it done. You need to make sure that everyone knows about it. And one thing I can tell you is that a lot of these RFPs and RFQs are actually quite difficult to find. Sometimes they're just on one particular website, sometimes they're published in local press, and sometimes they're on big international websites, which makes it easy. But as a program, as a client, you want as many bids as possible, so you want to get the word out. In terms of completing your procurement on time, you want to pay attention to the timeline that we've been talking about. You want to make sure that your files are ready when you tell your printer that the files will be ready. You want to make sure that your distribution company is ready to distribute once the books are produced. And you want to make sure that the school is ready to receive the books once they arrive. Again, executing the contracts on time requires oversight, it requires expertise, and you need staff who have the time and the skill set to pay attention to what's happening along every step. I just want to take a minute to say a word about corruption. So corruption continues to be a major issue in the book procurement process. We touched on it a little bit earlier today, but I just want to expand and underline the difficulties that corruption poses to book procurement all along the chain. It occurs at all stages of procurement, all stages of implementation, during production, during delivery, and during distribution. And so as education program staff, it's very important that you have this in mind and that you're putting measures in place to reduce it as much as possible. We should be looking at something like 95% of books arriving on time where they're supposed to go. Right now, the World Bank is estimating that only somewhere between 20 and 50% of books are arriving on time where they're supposed to go. So there's a huge gap in our supply chain, and most of that is around corruption. And so if we want to talk more about that during questions, I'd be happy to get into that. I just wanted to, since we have a couple of minutes, just touch on a couple of reasons from the printing and distribution side that we see for delays after award. So once your procurement has been awarded, we still see delays. So one of them is that the files come late. You may have thought that you were ready, your publisher was ready to submit the files August 1st, but the files actually end up coming at the end of September. So that, as you can imagine, causes cascading delays down the chain. Another thing that happens is that we get files with a lot of errors. So there's a lot of back and forth to make sure that the files are actually appropriate for printing. David and Roel both touched on the issue of detailed distribution lists. Without distribution lists, we cannot pack your books and we cannot distribute your books. Many times we receive no distribution list, incomplete distribution lists, incorrect distribution lists, and multiple changes in distribution lists. To the extent that for one procurement, I won't go into identifying details, but in one case, the books were actually on a ship. And we got word that they all needed to be repackaged because the distribution list had changed. Now, they were heading to a place where we didn't have staff and we didn't have facilities, so we had to hire staff and rent facilities to repackage all of the books in different size boxes, in different weights, and in different containers. So you can imagine the kind of cost and delays that something like that can create. The last big area of delays that we see is around track and trace and delivery verification. So it's very important to make sure you have your delivery verification system well established. You know how it's going to work. You have accurate contact information for the people who are receiving the books. And you have a system for receiving, filing, data entry, creating databases, monitoring those databases to make sure that you are verifying that all of the books arrived where they were supposed to go. So I'll stop there and turn it back to you, Anna.
Thank you. So I think questions should be coming in from participants, and we will select a few and let our panelists address some of these questions. Do Do you have any tips for building the capacities of procurement department staff? I don't know where this question is coming from, but I think it's a general enough question.
I think next slide when we talk about procurement management and planning, we'll give some ideas about the roles of procurers in the whole process. And again, the timeline. When do we start with procurement? What do we have to know, information to put in the RFQ? Which stakeholders are involved? Who is leading and following the process? And there are many ways to think about procurement in a way that procurement is part of the process. And what we see in large projects is that there is book development that takes a lot of time and is not always predictable, where procurement needs some hard data. Start procurement to be able to have a, let's say, a normal timeline to procure and award, to be in time with the whole process. And we see that book development is a process but not linked to procurement. I think if we talk about how to train procurement, I would say that within the team, and now I'm talking about the USAID projects, there must be a lot of intercommunication between the stakeholders in the team. Where are we? Can we have these deadlines? And can we use those deadlines within the RFQ, etc.? It has to be solved within the team.
I guess as a follow-up and related question, this is a bit more specific. This person is talking about schools being in different, I assume, hard-to-reach locations where there are no good transport facilities. And the question is, how can we manage book delivery in a timely manner and assure book delivery in time to students' hands in some of these hard-to-reach areas? So what would your suggestion be?
Again, I mean, also here, I mean, you hear the timeline. A short-time delivery is only possible in most cases when you produce in country or in the region. And most of procurement rules in many of the bids which are going out are limited to the look at the price. And as already mentioned, international printing is cheaper than in country or in the region. However, timelines are really very important. And if we have a short-time delivery into a region or schools, we should at least have a look at the region or in-country where to produce, what kind of capacity is there in country which can be used. And there are countries, like we have in Malawi, where, yes, I can move closer to the microphone. Alison, thank you. Is this better? There are countries where you can produce in country, and yes, the price might be higher or a little higher, but the timelines are shorter.
I know Penelope had a few things to add about timelines and project management.
So I just wanted to add a quick comment on distribution and then one on timelines. For distribution in hard-to-reach areas, this is a real challenge, but I would encourage programs to look at how are other things getting to those villages? How are vaccines getting to the villages? How are other goods getting to the villages, like matches, or people often like to bring up beer, which drives me crazy, but still it's a good point. How are other things getting to the villages? And so when you think about planning, think about, can we do it the same way? I know, for example, in DRC that people are walking the vaccines to villages, and sometimes you're just going to have to do that. I feel pretty strongly, as a person who's worked in development for a long time, that the hardest to reach should be the highest priority. And so that's where the resources need to go, in making sure that you have the canoes, the bicycles, the donkeys, the people, whatever you need to make sure that those students get the books. A note on timelines. I really feel that as a sector, we should be advocating for much more stable book procurements. Students need books every year in every subject, and it should be predictable and consistent. Just to go back to the health example, imagine if you had malaria medicine this year, provided by USAID, maybe in 3 years it was provided by UKAID, maybe in another 2 years by NORAD, but you never knew when anyone was going to procure it. That would not be a functioning health system. And for that same, we see that happening in education decade after decade, where the book procurements are just completely unpredictable, and you could have a decade before you get, for example, a 4th grade science book. And so working on regularizing those procurements, which I think is a task that the Global Book Alliance is taking on, would be a huge asset to everyone involved in the chain, and especially to the students who need books every single year.
Could I also just respond to that, to the distribution in the hardest areas? I fully agree with Penelope that that should be the priority when it's the hardest place to reach. But I also think that there needs to be some sort of incentive for that distribution to actually take place in the hardest areas. And sometimes what we're finding is that, for example, the Ministry of Education or the regional education department will rely on either local people or local principals or others that don't really have an incentive to actually get the books there on time, other than they really care about the children. And so that's another piece that I think is very important. I can give you one example where in Honduras, for example, and I know Roel knows this well, they were relying on local teachers to pick up the books at a central point, but they were relying on those teachers to do that on their own. And so that's very difficult for a local teacher to pay for their own bus ticket to go to the local area, to the regional area to pick up. So those are some of the things that really inhibit that distribution.
So reimbursing, in a way, would be the incentive.
Yeah.
Makes a lot of sense. Thank you. I don't know if we have time for more questions at this point, or if we should move on to the next section.
There are no more questions on the chat.
There is one more question, and hopefully David can get us started on a response. So the question is, the role of booksellers has not been touched upon. Could you please explain when they would play a part in this procurement process?
Thank you. The Kenyan experience is very unique because over the years, the booksellers have been the publishers' distributors, a role that we have appreciated. Indeed, it's because of what the booksellers across the country do that we've been able to reach difficult areas. But when you have a donor or government that will sometimes insist on sourcing direct from publishers and then dictating that publishers deliver to the door, it cuts off the bookseller, which is not a very, it's probably a cheap way of the government to get the books where they want them to go, but it kind of denies the bookseller the chance to sell the books on the ground. It also denies the publisher the kind of assistance we have had from the booksellers before. And this perhaps is not very healthy. Booksellers, in my opinion, through their associations, can work together so that we decide, or the government or the donor decides through a competitive process to have distributors appointed at local level, because to me, that will even sort out some of the difficulties we talked about, being able to reach those far off areas. Because if I have a bookseller in Mandera who becomes the distributor of my books in that region, he will have it easier getting to the schools than I coming from Nairobi. So booksellers are extremely important to us. And from where I come from my own standpoint, they are crucial in our industry. We may not be talking about them right now, but they are an important cog in what we do on a daily basis.
There's another question here in the room.
I have two questions. Thanks, everybody. And so my first question is to check my understanding. When I think about the differences between printing and publishing, I think of printing as sort of nesting within publishing. It's one aspect of a chain, and publishing has a lot more to do with owning copyright than producing a written document. But I think it would be very useful for us to be able to say, both on the webinar and in the notes from the webinar, exactly how to distinguish printing from publishing for people. So if we could review that section. And then in terms of measures to incorporate to reduce corruption, does anyone of the specialists on the webinar have a top 2 or 3 recommendations?
This corruption being is a real disease that eats into, as I spoke earlier, almost every sector as we grow. For us in the distribution chain, and that is why I am rooting for booksellers. When you have centralized procurement, you make it easier for the procuring officer to demand for a bribe. You just delay your lists deliberately. They will do a few other things because they know you have nowhere else to go apart from them. But if we distributed the procurement, in other words, decentralized, in a country like Kenya, we have 47 counties. If we went to all the 47 counties and we made procurement officers in each country responsible, then it would be very expensive, very, very expensive for the bidders to make attempts to bribe the procurement officers. Because they're, how do you bribe everybody and think you can get away with it? Spread the cost and make sure these people suffer hard. If you decentralize, if you centralize, you are actually inviting trouble. And that's the way I see it. And I don't know. I don't know. We don't punish the crooks because that's who they are. We don't punish them enough. And therefore they think it's something they can repeat today, tomorrow, and the day after. And the real people who do the work, the publisher, the author, a genuine and honorable bookseller, we lose out because somebody somewhere cut corners, and it's very painful, very, very painful. And the child is the one who suffers most because they do not get what they are supposed to get. And we will continue talking about it. I think it's up to us to police the delivery process to ensure that the child gets what is rightfully theirs. So I talk about this with emotions because I feel pain. As a business, I've lost plenty through corruption, and I feel that it's something that we should all fight against. In my country, it's rife and it's very bad, very bad.
Absolutely agree. Are there any comments, additional comments on the corruption question, or would anybody like to address the publishers versus printers question as well?
I can start with corruption and then talk
Sure.
about the publishing printing. It's hard to come up with the top 2 or 3 tips to fight corruption because there is corruption, as David was discussing, at every stage and every step. And since moving to the private sector, I can tell you that I've seen new kinds of corruption that I never even imagined could possibly happen. So it's rough out there. But I managed to come up with the top 3 or 4, and I have others that I can share. During the procurement process, my #1 tip is to have public bid openings. The World Bank does this, USAID projects do not. Everyone who bids on a procurement should have the right to be there for the bid opening, and the prices should be recorded at opening and distributed to all of the bidders. It should be a transparent process. for publishing, you should make sure that the authors are not government employees. The people approving the manuscripts should not be the people who are writing the manuscripts. And they should not be in their families, or there should be no link between the people approving manuscripts and the people who write them. In terms of printing, I strongly recommend completing pick and pack at the production site so that the boxes are sealed, strapped, and labeled at the point of production before they're delivered or distributed. And then for delivery and distribution, using QR codes and barcodes to track and trace the books. And then every program should be doing a post-delivery verification audit of a sample of the deliveries by an independent entity. This happens all the time in the countries where we work for other goods that are distributed in country. It does not happen for books and other TLM. So those would be my top tips, but I have about 20 more that I could share, and I see new kinds of things every day. In terms of publishing and printing, just to put it really, really super simply, with apologies to David, publishers create the books. Publishers do the amazing intellectual and artistic and creative work of making beautiful books with great content that children will learn from in all kinds of ways. That is the role, the completely irreplaceable and very important role of publishers. Printers take that book and make it a physical object. So we take that file and we put it on usually big machines and we produce millions of copies of it. So although publishers and printers can be related, they are completely separate industries. And when you contract them together, in most cases, your publisher will be outsourcing the printing to another company. Just like when you have a general contractor, they're going to outsource the electrical work to an electrician. And so, yes, so they're very different. Yes.
Different areas of expertise. So I don't know how we are doing in terms of time. I know there's a lot of participants are raising their hand and asking questions.
There's one more question that I saw here. It says, are there any innovations happening to either support local publishing or distribution companies? That's from Kate O'Kane. Innovations happening, I think, in respect to capacity building.
Capacity building for local
Publishers and distribution companies.
Okay. Well, Roel, you want to take a shot at answering that question?
I think I can answer it from the distribution part. We see most countries that publishers and the project from USAID, I mean, they're separate because the project will develop their own books. What is right or wrong, I think it's not the time to discuss this with this audience. From a distribution perspective, I know, and we've seen very good examples, that local distribution can be improved by working very closely together with the projects. Whenever we have a very transparent process, and that's what I think David and Penelope try to say also, to avoid corruption, the more we have in control the process and it's transparent, together with a very good distribution schedule and company, then I think that local capacity building in distribution is really a very, very good example of the capacity building in a country.
Can I also answer that?
Please.
I've seen 3 organizations, and they're international NGOs that actually have tackled this at a country level, which I think is quite exciting. One is Sophia's project in Rwanda, which was very interesting in terms of really supporting local publishers with training. And that was very unusual. A second one is World Reader, who is also doing a lot of training of publishers on the ground, and they have both for commercial purposes as well as for non-commercial purposes. And the third one is Room to Read. And I think all 3 of those are really looking at what is happening on the ground in terms of how to support publishers.
Just a word on distribution. I do want to point out the tension between project-driven supply chains and national supply chains. I think that is a big issue in our sector. I think as long as we have project-based approaches to improving education, we will have this tension. And as Roel said, it's not really the time to discuss whether it's right or wrong. But I do think for distribution, there's a lot of room in thinking about how are we working to improve the in-country supply chain. And a ton of work has been done on this in the health sector. And I think there are a lot of opportunities to bring colleagues from health and education together to think about what can we learn from successes and failures in health that could help us in education. Because again, books are not a one-off purchase. They're not a once-in-a-while purchase. They're something that you need consistently in a sustainable way. And so in order for that to happen, you will eventually need, as David said, booksellers, a thriving group of booksellers in the country, along with a national level supply chain. So when we think about designing projects, it should be with those end goals of countries being able to manage these systems by themselves and having the systems by themselves that are functioning.
There's one more question.
Okay.
Another question was from Sarah Anderson. She wanted to hear about experiences of combining the printing and distribution in one RFQ versus separating these two roles into two contracts. She wanted to hear about your experiences.
Start with Burda.
Okay, so that's really close to home, especially right now as we're working on some of each kind. I have to say that in our experience, just putting purely my Burda hat on, it works much better to do printing and distribution together. We then manage the distribution company. We make sure that the books are moved smoothly and quickly to the distributors, and then we supervise, follow up, and verify that all of the books have arrived at the sites. In a couple of cases that we've worked on recently, the distribution contracts have been separate, and we've had a lot of issues with delays. And when you have delays, you have storage. When you have storage, you have fees. When you have delays, you also have leakage. And so it has definitely not been very efficient, nor has it been cost effective. Now, of course, like with any outsourcing, printers, we do not have a fleet of trucks in, say, DRC, so we're outsourcing that distribution, and there's going to be a management cost. But I think in terms of time and efficiency and cost effectiveness, in my experience over the last just over a year now, it's been that it's worked better when they're together.
So, okay. I wonder actually if local printers and regional printers would have a similar response. I don't know if David perhaps could address that question. Say, would all types of publishers and printers prefer to also manage the distribution when it's this large scale?
No, it's interesting. In Kenya, 2 or 3 printers can handle printing and distribution, and they will do a very good job. Most of the others will have a big problem. And the problem comes from them not familiarizing themselves with the country per se. If they're in Nairobi, I think some of them just assume once they do the printing job, their job is done. But we do have about 3 printers who can do this job, combine and do it very well. What we do to deal with the situation is to give the job to a printer, and then we commission a distribution agency separately to work directly with the printer. It's an extra cost, unfortunately, because now you're not negotiating terms in the same way you are negotiating with one person about transport and ensuring that the books get where they're supposed to go, and the printer for the printing job. What that means is that you also start the risk of loss, because the printer will tell you, I handed over 100,000 copies of books to the distributor. When the distributor gets to the ground, they'll come back to you and tell you they only received 90,000. It becomes very difficult to know where the shortage came from. And quite often, it's the publisher again who suffers, because you can't pin anybody down. The distributor will tell you, this is what I delivered. The printer will say, this is what he collected from me, it comes very, very, very difficult. But yes, ideally, if the printer is able to take the job of printing and distribution, it saves the publisher a lot of time and headache.
Right. So I would think also addressing the issue of understanding the context, each country, the capacity of national printers, how close you are to regional printing plants, and what is the preferred scenario between printing internationally, regionally, or at a national level, and doing a capacity assessment. I know we have just a few more minutes in this segment, so I would like to let Roel speak a little bit about capacity assessments of printing in different contexts.
Okay. Yeah, that's what we normally try to do in our project with our clients. What we do is we try to find out what is the situation in a country. What can we achieve if we can start up a collaboration between projects related to the government and the private industry? What we see is that private industry is willing to invest if they know where the let's say the book process is going to. The book market for printing is huge. So if we can, and we see it, we are now, Linda just mentioned, we work now in Honduras, we see already movement in the industry, because now they understand more and more the projects of donors and the willingness of the government to think about doing things in country. Then the industry will move, and we will see a capacity building in a country where within 1 or 2 years' time, they will increase their capacity, not only the capacity, but the knowledge of the people working in the industry. They have more employment, they do workshops on all kinds of technical issues, and they learn how to talk and discuss projects with the customers. We've seen many local printers who are really, they have no idea how to address a bid, how to make tender documents, how to work together with large companies. So I think that is really a challenge for projects and countries to build this local capacity. It does not mean that all projects can produce in the country where the project is. Sometimes the demand of the project is just too large for local capacity. But I think it also, if we look, we just spoke about, we heard it many times, about timelines in procurement and timelines to get the books in school in time. If you can produce in country or in the region, then timelines are much shorter. So I think it's a very good challenge for all those projects to develop the.
Thank you, Roel. So now moving on, I know, I believe it was Penelope mentioned how it's hard for printers to find RFQs that have been released. So the next segment, and I'll hand it over to Sophia, is about key principles for attracting bidders.
Thanks, Anna. Hello again. So I know a lot of the issues have already come up, and Penelope touched on some aspects of timelines, but we know that problematic procurements or failed procurements is one of the most common causes for delays in projects. And I'm sure many of the participants have experienced that. So we wanted to talk about some of the key principles for attracting bidders. Because we've already touched on a few, I'm going to leave it kind of open and start with Penelope and ask her, from a printer and a distributor's standpoint, how can projects attract the highest number of responsive, competitive bidders who are submitting quotes at or below industry norms? What are some kind of top tips that you can give us?
All right, let me see. So we really do see quite a lot of difference in the number of bidders on different projects. Sometimes in one country there will be over 20 bids, and in another country you'll only have 2 or 3. So there is a huge difference, and you can point to quite a few things that make that happen. It's not just a mystery. So the first one, in the countries that tend to receive more bids, is when tenders are very reliable. Everyone knows that the tender in country X is going to come out in June, 6 months before they need the books. This happens every single year. Everyone knows and everyone is ready to go. The second important point is that those tenders are also very well advertised, as you just mentioned. Everyone knows about them. Everyone can get the tender documents. You know, in some countries, you have to actually go to the Ministry of Education in the country and pay a particular person to get the tender documents. That can make it very difficult for a company to compete. And when companies are thinking about whether they want to compete, they're thinking about how much is it going to cost. Just as I'm sure implementing partners, when they decide if they want to bid, they're thinking about what will the costs be of the bid. It's the same thing in the private sector. If we have to fly someone far away and have them stay there several days to try to track down the person in the ministry, it's less likely that we're going to bid on it. Another important issue is around the size of the tender. When tenders get very big, there's a smaller number of printers that are able to bid on that tender. And the tenders also tend to get caught up in a lot more review and oversight processes, so it takes a lot longer to award the tender. So better to keep the tenders manageable and have, you know, a couple than to have everything in one giant tender that people can't apply for. Another thing that's very important, and I kind of want to plead to everyone out there, is to communicate with the bidders. You need to have a time for questions. The responses to questions need to go out to everyone. There needs to be a reasonable amount of time to prepare the bids after the questions are answered. And then as the procurement process continues, you need to communicate with the bidders. You're always asking bidders to have bids that are valid for 60 days or 90 days. It's very rare in our experience that our awards are made during the 60 or 90 days. So we're always wondering, should we extend the bid validity? Should we extend it? Is this still happening? Is it not happening? Communicate with your bidders and they'll be more interested in participating in the projects. And then the very last, but perhaps the most important thing, is to ensure that the process is transparent. If companies spend resources to bid on a project, if they find out they're the lowest bidder and they don't get the contract, or as it often happens in USAID projects, they don't find anything out, they just hear 6 months later that, oh, someone else was awarded the contract, they're less likely to compete to submit an offer again. I'll stop there.
How about technical specifications? Do you have any advice on how to include technical specs that likely attract more bidders?
So I think on that, the most important thing is to have correct technical specifications. We're not going to get into all of the details today, but I know that USAID has produced several resources that lay out, and blueTree also has produced resources that lay out what technical specifications should look like. So the more that you can conform to those technical specifications, which is usually things like using standard paper sizes, making sure that all your books have a number of pages divisible by 4, using a paper weight and opacity that are consistent with industry norms, the more likely it's going to be that you get a large number of bidders and that your process, not only your procurement process, but your production process moves forward smoothly. So if you have any questions on that, I'm sure that the Global Reading Network can send out those resources. Again, and I think we might have another webinar to go into more depth on that. blueTree is also a great resource for those questions.
Great, and I think also the clarity of the technical specs, that's where I see some issues when it's a bit ambiguous about what exactly the project is looking for. So I would encourage projects to really be as clear and specific as possible.
Yes, and I'm hoping USAID will develop some templates that everyone will have access to, so it will just lay out exactly what you need to have and what the options are, just to make it simpler and faster for everyone.
Thanks. Now we're going to turn over to you, David. How about from a publisher's perspective? You put a few on the slide, but feel free to touch on any that we haven't yet talked about, your perspective of attracting bidders.
Yeah, I'm happy with what you're saying because some of the issues I had have already been addressed. But yeah, think about, as I said, issue transparency. Is that the issue of knowing exactly what the procuring authority wants? Because when you don't know, then you don't know what to do. And you don't know what to provide. You cannot give any information. So the instructions must be clear. How about also, if it is me you want to talk to, if you want to single source, talk to me. But don't ask me to give you impossible discounts, knowing clearly that I can't afford. Forcing me literally to give my products for free is not good enough. I think as much as we want to give the child a good product, I think I need to feed my house. I also need to clothe myself. It's fair if we can say that price should not be preferred to quality, because quite often again we emphasize on price, the lowest bidder, etc., versus the quality of the product. I think the content that you are buying should be given more value than the what would I call it? Than the cost of the final item. Let it be noted, for example, in many countries, Africa being one of them, and Kenya being in particular, there is no paper industry. So all the paper that could be used in printing books is imported. And when you import the paper, it arrives here, you print the book, it's going into the market, there is VAT on it. The final cost is bound to be higher than if the same book was done in India or any other country. But even if you do the book in India, the moment it arrives in Nairobi, you still pay VAT. And therefore the Kenyan book becomes less competitive than it would be elsewhere. Whatever we do, let's think about sustainability. And to me, sustainability will not happen if the local publisher, if the local bookseller, if the local printer is ignored. So perhaps some kind of subsidy should be considered when you're thinking about support of the local publisher or the local. So when it's an international bidding, let it be understood, as I said, that the Indian publisher would be exposed to easier paper, cheaper paper, more abundance of the paper. I would have that, and therefore I might not be as competitive as that Indian publisher. So yeah, consider that local input. Whatever you do, whatever is being done, let it be understood that the local publisher needs a bit of support. One thing that was said that I support from the bottom of my heart, USAID, please, come clean in whatever you do. 2 years ago, and I say this again with bitterness of sorts, more than 2 years ago, they make us sit down and rush us to develop books for early grade reading. We did a lot of work here in Nairobi, and the books were evaluated by KICD. We paid a lot of money for the evaluation. 2 years down the line, we still don't know the answers to what we did. We're still waiting for USAID and RTI to either buy or tell us they have given the cost. So the little resources I have to spend to develop a product as required by a procuring authority, and then they take 2 years and more to procure. That is hurtful. That is inhuman. They should do better than that, so that they know that I'm a business person, and the little money I have, I would like that money to benefit me in growing my business. Thank you.
Thanks, David. I think it's important we hear some of these grievances from a publisher's perspective so we can be sure to take them into consideration when planning for a procurement. A follow-up question I had was, how would some of these considerations differ depending on the size of the procurement? So if it were procuring a couple hundred storybooks versus a couple million, which I know, Penelope, you talked about. So what kind of considerations should we make based on the size of the procurement in terms of attracting bidders?
So it really depends on the context. A couple of hundred is definitely going to be a local printer, probably digital printing. That's a very, very small order. The question comes up when you get more into the middle, when you're talking about like 50,000, something like that, 25,000. One thing to keep in mind is that with modern printing, it's very easy to print materials in different languages, so it doesn't have that much of an effect. If you're doing 50,000 in language 1, 50,000 in language 2, it's not that much more expensive than doing 100,000 in just one. But if you're looking at very small print runs, in countries that have publishing printing capacity, you're looking at local, sometimes regional. So one thing that we're interested in doing is partnering more with local printers who are handling some of those orders, but having trouble moving up to the next level to handle more of the mid-size orders, to think about how can we support them, particularly in terms of paper procurement and ink procurement, because we're buying in bulk, so we can pass those savings along to local partners and just make it easier for them to get the consumables that they need to be competitive in local and regional markets.
Interesting. Mm-hmm. And how about you, David? What kind of bid is too small for a publisher of your size to be interested in bidding for?
When you are needed, you go for anything. Sometimes, depending on quantities, even 2,000, 3,000, 10,000 copies, I'll go for. But it is very important that if you have a situation, given the number of children we have in the country, if you're talking of anything 50,000 onwards to orders we were getting from the government recently of 1 million copies, that becomes very, very attractive. And it is then easier when you have the larger numbers, because of the economies of scale, you are able to give the books to the buyer at a lower price. If you're buying 1,000 or 2,000 copies, the cost to you per unit is definitely much higher. So yes, I would participate on condition, of course, even for smaller quantities, that the payment terms are conducive. I'm not going to wait for months on end to be paid. If I'm promised that I'll be paid on delivery after it's proved that I've done my delivery and everything is good, I'll take the bid. I will participate in the bid.
Thanks.
So I'll just go to some key issues in procurement management and planning, where we see the first part is procurement and planning. And one of the issues in procurement planning is that the process of this book development is not predictable in many of our projects, which makes planning of procurement very difficult. And the other side is that whenever we start early with procurement, we have more time, and we need this time in the whole process. So in this procurement planning, we need to say, okay, what type of quantitative quality of materials are needed? Most of the time, we don't know exactly how many. Is that a problem? I don't think so. I think we should go ahead with the RFQ, but we see in both stages, at the end, there will be changes. Who is responsible of tasks, activities, and timelines? Who's in the lead? Who will manage the process from procurement until the books are in schools? Then we go to a bidding and development and publishing of RFQ, RFP, request for proposal, or request for quotation. I think with this item, there are many RFQs which are not complete. it should be addressed that there are so many issues that should be in the RFQ, and that really it gives you a throwback, because you will get a lot of questions which has to be answered. A lot of time is taken into this answering of questions which should be addressed already in the RFQ. Then you will receive proposals and bids. We'll evaluate them with a team, get an opening procedure. You will find out that offers which are not correct should be eliminated. And then we have the technical aspects. And what is the most important in this RFQ? Is it price? Is it timeline? I mean, it's not only price, as David already mentioned. Price is a part of the whole thing you deliver, the book you deliver. At the end, you'll take a decision, and you have to communicate. Communicate as early as possible with the supplier. Make the supplier part of your team. Make a contract, develop and sign, and manage the relation between the buyer and the seller. It is not that I buy a pencil, I go home and I can write with a pencil. The supplier is part of the process. It will guide you from printing until the book is in the school. But a very important part of the process. Then make sure that the performance of both parties to the procurement meets contractual requirement. And in that case, I mean, if you communicate with the suppliers as a part of your team, integrated part of the team, this will not be a big issue. At the end, as Penelope already mentioned, are the books in school? Do we verify that the materials that you ordered, the amount of materials, the right books to the right schools, do we control it? Are we in control of that process? Then we have to finalize, do we have claims? Are there issues along the whole process? And finalize them. Payments. I think we have to mention that we see in some cases also, I mean, we know from government that whenever you work with government, that payments might be a very difficult issue and will take a lot of time. However, I think that all those projects, that payments should be in time, as printer and distribution companies have invested in paper, in trucks, in fuel, human resources. So I think payments should be really very, very careful planned and done by the vendor. At the end, evaluate with all stakeholders, also with supplier, what have we done, what are lessons learned, how can we improve it for next time? Not just finish the project, go on with normal day-to-day work and do the same next year. Have your lessons learned, evaluate the process and move forward. I think that's what we like to see in procurement management and planning, and of course each topic you can go in depth, but this is in general what we would like to see in place. There are some components of the RFQ, the background, and procurement description, activity overview, when will the release date be there? We talk to the customers and suppliers or the bidders when they can expect the award, proposals, close submission deadline, award date. That's really important, as we know that in this case the printer has to buy paper and he has to plan his equipment. And with all means, November and December are the most busiest time for all printers in the world. And what we see in projects, what's the busiest time to print? It's November and December. because January or early February schools will start. So the printers should be able to plan their equipment and buy paper. The commodity specifications, do we have the right specs for those books? Do we know about specs? What are specs? What is GTM? How do we bind the book? What kind of binding do we use? Do we need lamination? Do we need packaging? How many per box? Again, timelines and the terms and conditions. The instructions from the bidder sellers. From sellers, they must record their pricing. The questions concerning the procurement, notifications and deliveries, documentation required for payment for each item, the payment terms, alternative proposals, absolutely, inspection process, and I wonder how many projects do really inspect on site. If we buy 5 million books and we don't inspect them on the press, can we expect the right output? We spend millions of millions of dollars to buy those books. We don't inspect them on site. I think the inspection process should be much better. Board notice, value of offer, and representations. Then we have the evaluation process, evaluation and award, price. Most of the time, price is one of the highest awarded points in a RFQ. Delivery, when do delivery schedule, and what do we do when they don't deliver in time? Technical specifications, as described in the RFQ. The past performance. Does a bidder ask past performance? Or are we looking into this gray area where someone will bid but doesn't have any printing facility? Do we check the past performance? Do we request samples from a past performance? The lead time and availability of products and services. Can the printer and distribution company deliver these products and services? We have evaluated in our country assessments many printers, and sometimes we see that bid for a tender, which I'm 100% sure they cannot do. But they want this order, they want to produce. We've seen in countries, even today, that large procurement has been done to a printer where 100% sure he cannot deliver it out. And then the warranty and quality of the product. Can we guarantee, do we know sure that the quality of the books and product is that what we expected? I think that some of the components in the RFQ, and again, I mean, we can go in depth to each component, but I think this is in general what we would like to see in the whole RFQ.
Great. And from a project management perspective, the lead time, I know that can be unrealistic. What advice would you give to projects on how to calculate a realistic lead time for their procurement?
Of course, it depends. Lead time depends, highly depends on transport. With printing, and we have Penelope from Burda sitting, that can print millions of books in a week and finish in another week. The transport might take 45 days. So it highly depends on where you buy the books. The lead time should be evaluated. That's what I said in the first sheet. Do we have people in procurement or in project team who have knowledge about this creating lead times, creating timelines for production and distribution, how to make timelines, what kind of equipment does the printer have so that you can predict that he can produce it in time? That will define the lead time. But if we see that we still have to procure books today to be delivered early January, it will be very difficult.
Also, Roel, you talked about some areas of inefficiency being issues that are not included in the RFQ. Could you highlight a few examples of common issues that are sometimes not included in the RFQ?
One of the issues is packaging. Do we pack and label at the printer site, or do we wait and bring them to a country in a big warehouse and start doing things there, which is time consuming. It is questionable that we can avoid loss and damage of books. So that's one example. Other examples are not the right specs or not the right PDFs in the beginning. So whenever we do book development, normally it's done in a team and they work on computers, but it's not similar to bring it to the printer who has to produce materials. So whenever the PDF is ready, that will be sent to a printer, and the printer can tell you, sorry, the PDFs are not correct. This is also, again, time consuming to create the right PDFs.
I just wanted to add, there's one other thing that we don't see very often in RFQs that I think people might want to consider including, and that is more about the equipment that the printer has and requiring some kind of verification of that equipment. That verification can be done in different ways, and you have to balance between, time consuming and more efficient. But it's really important to make sure that the printers you're using have the equipment they need to produce the product that you're asking for. So I would recommend more emphasis on that in RFQs and RFPs.
I just want to add to that. I think that's again, in the start of the process, the lack of knowledge in the project team or in the procurement team about, okay, what kind of printers do we have? What kind of equipment do they have? What kind of packaging facilities do they have? Do they communicate about how to transport, how to do customs? And I think if these things can be addressed at the start of the process, we'll gain a lot of time.
So that wraps up the final session, and we're going to start taking some questions from participants based on any of the previous presentations, but we'd also love input from participants on what they would like to see covered in upcoming workshops. So if you have any thoughts, please go ahead and share them now so we can be sure to cover them before we wrap up. So the first question, I think, is speaking to this process that Roel outlined. But how would this differ now that we're in this digital era and we have ebooks on the rise? How would this procurement process differ if we were procuring ebooks? So I don't know who wants to open up. Roel, if you have any thoughts on procurement of ebooks.
Besides whatever we can think about the pedagogical issues of ebooks or TLMs, I believe that there are many areas where connectivity is an issue, where the question is, if we give ebooks to students or schools, will they be there in the next 3 months? And from my experience, the books and supplementary reading materials will give certainly the early grade reading children the opportunity to play with books, play with words, play with a lot of things, and I think that's for me. But I mean, ebooks can be uploaded, and you can send them with 100 titles to a school. Yes, okay. I don't know from pedagogical side that more you address the table there. I have my questions about it.
Tell me, did you have any thoughts on ebooks?
For early grade reading, in terms of a business perspective, we're not really projecting that the market will move into ebooks for another 10 or 15 years. We're looking at markets in developed countries. And for the early grades, we're certainly seeing an increased use of technology, but we are not seeing the replacement of print books, supplementary readers, or textbooks for the early grades. When we did the Global Book Fund feasibility study, we looked at those options. And we found that in general, it was going to be more expensive and less effective for the early grades to use electronic. But for high school in particular, it might be a good way to go. Certainly you have different kinds of issues around protecting authors' rights when you have ebooks and open licensing, and I'm sure David can speak to that more than I can. And it's a completely different kind of procurement. You're really talking about procuring devices and then disseminating content.
I'm sure there's other considerations around sustainability and the text
Yes.
work and all the problem shooting that needs to come once you introduce technology, particularly.
As I always said, no electricity means no electronics. So hopefully soon they'll be more available. Certainly it's a great way of disseminating information.
Great, so we're going to look at what kind of questions are coming in here. So there's a question. It says, publishers' knowledge of early grade reading content and instruction is sometimes limited. However, we want them involved in book development. How can we make this feasible in the timeline and time frame of EGR programs? Any examples of how this has worked well? I would like to respond to this. Maybe to start off. Yes. Yeah. Linda mentioned a bit about some of the work we've done in Rwanda, and I think a key consideration is not just building the capacity of publishers. You need to look at the entire book chain, everyone that's involved in developing books. And then the sustainability issues of the demand, market demand for those books. So I think it involves programs to be more strategic and thoughtful in their planning of how they are going to engage with publishers and build their capacity. Because David mentioned, if we want societies to remain literate after the life of a USAID project, we need to make sure that there is a vibrant publishing industry that continues to produce reading materials for children at all ages, that doesn't stop at P3 or P4. So I think it's a very important consideration for projects, and I encourage you all to really engage with the book sector in your countries and figure out where are their capacity gaps and how you can support them. I don't know if Linda, you want to share any other?
No, it's an excellent response, and I think also David should respond to this. But I think the point that we're working with ADEA, which is the Africa organization that works on education and development, and they are looking hard at this issue of how to really support the capacity development of publishers, because and doing it from the perspective of gathering what are the publishers really looking for. So what kind of training are they looking for? They're particularly concerned, and I know David has talked about this as well, about the government policy. So how do they advocate to the government? They'd like that kind of capacity. They'd also like the capacity to understand how to develop leveled and decodable readers. They'd like also to understand the whole publishing process so that they can do a better job of that. How do they build their business case for that? So there are lots of aspects for publishers that they're really looking for support. There are some, as David and others, there's some publishers that have these skills already. But for the majority that we've talked to, particularly in West Africa and other areas of Africa, and some in Southeast Asia, it is a real challenge, and they would really appreciate capacity building.
And I think bringing it back to this procurement discussion, some of the decisions that you make in your RFQ are going to exclude local publishers, which may be appropriate for larger tenders that they don't have the capacity to handle. But I think it's particularly when you have smaller ones, looking at how you can, for example, the experience, what kind of experience they need to demonstrate, maybe loosening those requirements for smaller tenders when you believe that you do have some capacity in country for publishers to bid.
So another thing just to mention that I hope most of you are familiar with already is that USAID spent quite a bit of time, along with SIL and others, developing software to help publishers produce leveled and decodable titles much more easily. So the hope is that that software will enable more publishers to enter the market. And I know that we're really hoping to see that in the next few years.
That software has really taken off. And it's being, I think, spread quite rapidly and widely. So that's the good news.
David, did you want to share some thoughts on this?
I don't know what I can say here, because for me, I see the greatest threat to the publishing industry, particularly in Africa, is the abandoned will of the government to think that publishers are not doing a good job, and therefore they think they can do a better job. It is happening in Rwanda, where because of the government's own laxity, books didn't get to schools on time, and publishers are blamed for it. And in the process, it's used as an excuse for the government now to get into publishing. What that will mean is that the sustainability we've been talking about is not guaranteed when you take publishing from the private sector to government. And we've seen it happen in Kenya in the past. We hope it will never happen again. We've seen it happen in Tanzania. We've seen it happen in Malawi. And we fear, in some of these countries, publishing has suffered terribly. When we think about digital publishing, and I'm glad I hear everybody agreeing that for early grade materials, we still need the printed product, and it's going to be there with us for a long time to come. Overemphasis on digital publishing is not going to help the situation. It's just going to confuse the children, because funding, both at government level and even from donors, is not forthcoming, and it could cause chaos in Africa. I have not even seen it happening in other developed countries. I was in Japan recently and was amazed at the number of books that are sold through bookshops, even alongside the other electronic gadgets. So for us, the greater assistance that we need from international bodies, and these I would want to point to USAID, DFID, UNICEF, others, is to try and let the government know that publishers need support in form of training, in form of bringing on board international players to come and train local participants, so that we improve our local capacity instead of the government thinking they can do the job themselves. To me, that would only probably make corruption thrive even more.
Yeah, I see a few questions coming in kind of related to this in the same vein of the relationship between publishers and governments. And I know as an implementing partner, sometimes you can play a role of kind of marriage counseling between the two actors. So there's one specific point raised about how governments can refuse to give advance payments. And publishers and printers can wait a year to get payment. So I don't know if any of you guys have any thoughts on if there's a role that implementing partners can play in terms of supporting governments to be more efficient in their payments.
Oh. I mean, that's a tough one. It's a huge issue for us. Being a German company, you can imagine we have a lot of, it's a huge company, and there are a lot of staff who think it's very risky already to be in this line of work. And when payments are often delayed by 6 months to a year, or even more in some cases. So it's very, very difficult. We have insurance to cover non-payment and some other circumstances, and that certainly helps. And the volume of business helps, but it has a huge impact, particularly on country level and regional publishers, printers, and distributors. And it's not only governments. This might make me, even less popular, but it's implementing partners and USAID as well. We work really hard to produce the books on time, and it's a huge issue for our business when we don't get paid.
And when the government pays you, when they delay your payment, like it has happened to me in Rwanda again, they come back 2 years and they start penalizing you for late delivery, and yet they don't pay you for the time they have overstayed without paying you. I don't know how we can deal with it, but isn't it possible for all of us, like we did in Kenya many years ago, when we discussed with the government and told them that they should be enamourers, not doers. They should not be the judges and the jurors at the same time, about book business. They should enable us to do business. And fortunately, although they still have two parastatals operating and competing with us, at least they do allow an element of free trade in the country, which we enjoy. Can't we probably donors, because we also at that time required bodies like DFID and others to come in and tell the government that they should step away from participating in business and let the private sector do what they are supposed to do, and that be enforced, so that instead of financing through government, whoever is the procuring authority in this case, even if it is a bilateral agreement, can't you be the one to pay the bidders instead of the other way around? Because, so long as the procurement laws are, being followed properly, isn't it easier that somebody is paid instead of giving money to government who come up with all sorts of excuses to delay settlement?
There's a question, I think, around project management, which, Roel, you might be best placed to answer. You mentioned bringing suppliers into your team to improve communication and the working relationship, but in doing that, how do you prevent any conflicts of interest arising? Especially in small context where somebody's
what I meant is bringing the team after awarding the contract. Normally what you see is that the supplier has been treated as a supplier where they are involved in the complete process from printing and delivering the books into schools. So they are in that situation, after awarding the contract, part of the whole team to get the books in schools. And the communication between the vendor and the supplier is really very limited. And I think that can be much better, and it will improve the whole process and also the learning curve in the process for the team. Oh, we can do it.
Great, last question. There's a request for someone to speak a bit about the specifications for bulk handling and how that helps districts and schools. So if it's the wrapping of the cartons, et cetera. So I don't know if you have any last final thoughts to share on specs for bulk handling.
So I think at another session we'll get more into the details, but I would argue, or I would say that you need to be very cognizant of how your books are going to be transported at each stage in the distribution process. So you may well be using containers, shipping containers, to move your books into the country. Then you're looking at unpacking those containers and moving books on pallets. Then you're looking at taking cartons of books off the pallets, and then people are actually carrying the cartons. I think it was actually UNESCO that came up with some standard that the boxes should not be heavier than the weight of an average 12-year-old child or something like that in a particular country. So the cartons, I think, are supposed to be less than 40 pounds. However, we did just get an order for cartons with 1,000 books per carton, so that's going to be more than 40 pounds. But just to say that you need to think about the entire delivery process and how the books will be packaged to ensure that they can be moved by the people and equipment that's supposed to move them, and also that the books are being protected. You want your books to be in heavy boxes, you want them to be wrapped, and you want them to be strapped. Because whether or not, if you ordered the books in the dry season, well, guess what? There's a delay in the port and there's an early rain and all of a sudden your books are getting wet. So since you're spending quite a lot of money on them, you do want to spend the marginal extra cost to make sure that they're well protected.
So that's it for the questions. Thank you for the really lively discussion. Hi, everybody. And I wanted to thank everybody who participated on the panel, Linda, Roel, Penelope, and David, particularly David, who's here late, and you can see it's gotten dark in the background while he's been sitting with us. I really appreciate the expert input you provided on preparing for procurement. That is the focus of this session, and I think we really had a lot of rich discussion and really great questions as well. We had a lot of technical questions online, and I wanted to just share a couple of things. One is that we're in the process of preparing some guidance on preparing early grade reading book procurement. So some of those technical questions will be covered in that document, but we thought that it would be better to dive into some of these technical questions that individuals asked online in a subsequent session. We wanted to really kind of talk about the major issues around book procurement and preparing your team and gearing up for it and putting yourself in a place to be most effective as you put it together. But the question of technical specifications and looking into RFPs and sort of tackling some of the challenges and actually also hearing from the industry as to what not to do, I think that will make a great lively session in itself. So we're going to work on that. We're going to take your questions that you shared and some of the comments here and think about how to creatively create a new session. I would like for you, if you had any burning questions related to specifications or just sort of the details of putting a book procurement together, we'd like you to share them at info@globalreadingnetwork.net. We're also going to share the PowerPoint from today and the audio from today, so you'll be able to review it later if you had to. And then if you have any other questions related to the topics we covered today, you can feel free to ask them, and we will try to get a response from the panelists and get a response back to you. So without further ado, I just wanted to close the session and say thank you for participating this morning. Thank you, everybody here, for the hard work you put into putting this together. Thank you, David and Roel, for joining us from a distance. And really, we look forward to working with you again on a future session. And please look for soon this book procurement guidance and some upcoming sessions in our newsletter.